Welcome to the It Matters podcast. I'm your host, Walter Perez, and let's dive in as we help you grow your mindset and elevate your leadership. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited that you're joining us today. I have a very special guest, and I'm very excited to have this conversation because I have Tim Sesink with me today. And as all of you know, that I am all about wholeness, making sure that we got all our areas in our lives lined up. And one part of my life is that faith is very important to me. And Tim is not only my pastor, but he is a friend and a spiritual mentor to me in so many ways. And I thought it would be great for you guys to know him a little bit. And I also understand where I get some of these values and foundation that I built my business on, and why I love talking about, leadership, personal growth, and everything that encompasses that, and the way we think. And so, Tim, this is such an honor. I appreciate you being on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's a pleasure. I am delighted to do it and to sit down and have a chat. We see each other all the time in person, but now to do it through this means is great as well. I'm excited to share a little bit with those who are paying attention to this as well.
I agree. And I just, we've known each other for a number of years here. And I love what you represent. And I would love to just kind of share with the audience like a little bit more about you. And maybe you can kind of let us in a little bit, because I know
I'm not that interesting.
But well, I don't know. I mean, you're folk. You love being outdoor. Yeah. You've done a few different things. Yeah. You've been a chaplain, and you've been on this journey for a little while. Yeah. So why don't you let us in a bit?
Yeah, I try to walk the way of Jesus in our world, and that means paying attention to those who are hurting, those who are on the margins of life, to those that society walks by, and also helping people discover freedom in their life. Because I think so often we become enmeshed and addicted to the things that might be good, but become the ultimate in our lives. And so, I'm passionate about that. A lot of what I do in the church that I lead is community transformation work. We want our community to be a better place because our church is here. And so helping our community as a church community engage with the community here around us. And also done quite a bit of work doing chaplaincy work as well. So doing crisis care in particular, which is it's kind of different than a regular chaplaincy, in the fact that it's about crisis and about being there when potentially trauma, things that could create trauma in a person's life, so that you can be there to help walk them through the initial stages of the processing.
I love that. I'm going to ask you a question about that in a moment.
Sure,
but for those of us listening here today that are not too sure about this faith thing or spiritual thing, I want you to hang on with us, because there's some very valuable points that we want to share. And wherever you are in the journey with that, that's completely okay.
Absolutely.
But check out what we're going to chat about, because I think there'll be some good takeaways for you that will add a lot of value. You were mentioning about being a crisis care chaplain, and you're talking about trauma and people being in pain and hurting. Like, I love that you're saying that, because how did you see your role be significant in that? Because I know that there is, we can go the clinical way, we can talk about different approaches on that, but spirituality plays a role in that. And I'd love to maybe unpack that a bit.
It does. With trauma care, I mean, there's a lot of evolving science around it, and I feel like it changes almost every year in the different approaches. But some things are consistent across them, and that is someone who is there, who can listen, who can care, who can provide a place of processing fairly soon after the trauma has occurred. And so with crisis care, really the idea is you're being present with people shortly after the crisis has occurred, and you're non-judgmental. You're not there to assess blame. You're not there to try and push a certain perspective. You're there to listen, and then to help them connect with long-term supports as well. And it means being a person of faith. I believe that God is at work in our world, and if I can pay attention to where God is at work in a person's life, and I can listen to that and provide a space for that, it's really important. And I think what we're realizing is that many people in our world have a form of faith. It may be Buddhism, it may be Islam, maybe Christianity, but actually the majority of people in the world have a faith perspective. And so allowing a space for people to share that, and my work, while I come from a Christian perspective, is actually allowing them and encouraging them in the perspective that they come from. And so giving them space to share how they are processing that. And so, and often for folks, that's very, it's very healing to them on their journey, because we're not bits and pieces. Our faith directly affects the way that we view the world and the way that we engage with our hurts and our wounds. And so, giving a space for that and validating that is often very important.
It can be very renewing, right? In that process,
right? Yeah.
Which then makes me wonder here, though, because lately I've been talking a lot about wholeness. We talk about, okay, get your mindset in the right place, get your physical body in a healthy situation. And I mean, you just approached spirituality from a state of helping people that are maybe hurting or broken. But there's also that side about us. There's a healthy aspect of us pursuing spirituality too, though.
Absolutely.
And how do you see that play? Not just using spirituality and faith as like, I need help, so I need to go and run to that, but keeping it as part of our life.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a growing realization that we're more than sticks and stones. Like that there's these other parts to us that science can't quantify. Love, mercy, grace, and peace. These things aren't, you can't put a measuring stick. And so we're realizing that there's these things beyond the quantifiable that we need to reflect on, we need to give space for in our lives. And I think having faith really allows us to do that, to create. And I think spirituality, as a buzzword, it can mean a lot of different things to different folks. But for me, a spirituality based in the way of Jesus helps me engage the world from a place of love, mercy, and grace, and actually incorporating those practices. I always find it interesting. People often go and sit on a bench and stare off, and they may not know it, but that's a spiritual practice. They're practicing silence. They're practicing solitude. Like, these are ancient practices that have been part of the Christian faith for thousands of years, creating these spaces to reflect. And so I think, even in some of the practices of people who wouldn't come from a faith perspective, they're actually doing some of the faith practices which have undergirded healthy spirituality for a very long time. And so I think a lot of it is finding, what can I do in this moment to create space for me to hear the transcendent, to reflect on the things beyond the quantifiable. How can I do that? Whether that's sitting on your back deck and enjoying creation and becoming aware of God's presence around you, whether that's going for a walk and intentionally being quiet. There's a variety of practices that we can put in place in our daily lives that don't require hours and hours and a schedule and us going somewhere. They can be incorporated into just the minute by minute parts of our day.
You know what I love about when you say these practices, because sometimes we can put things in boxes and we think, well, that's only a spiritual act, and you did such a beautiful job in showing us, like, when we're practicing loving people, when we're practicing forgiving, showing mercy and grace, those are very spiritual things. But at the same time, whether you believe it or not, we all want to feel loved. We all want to experience that grace, right? And the list goes on.
Well, we all want to experience what it means to be known and to know others. Like we all desire these points of connection. And spirituality, I think, when it's grounded in a reality of the other around us, that actually it's the communities to which we belong and participate and engage in that actually help kind of bolster this. I think it's part of our Western individualism. One of the challenges, there's some benefits as well, but one of the challenges is it's really created this, I myself on my own, develop my own spirituality, have my own beliefs, have my own practices. And while there's an element of that that's true and is required, it really removes us from this idea. Actually, we're called to be in communities that help foster our growth. And as we grow in our spirituality, as we grow in the practices that build character in us, like they actually ripple through our communities, and we also receive that in turn. So that's why I'm a big believer in this place I'm sitting in called church, because it's a community in which people can practice this together, in which people can help one another walk forward. And now for those who are listening, you may not be in a church, but maybe there's another community that can be beneficial to you, right? Where you can engage in, and there's that reciprocation of spiritual practices that actually leads to a strengthening.
Okay, well, let's unpack something here, because you touched on something really important. So we got this individual journey mindset, and you got this community mindset. So the individual first. I think you're a really great example. I mean, you love being in the outdoors.
I do.
You like hunting.
If you can see my office, it's like snowshoes and paddles on the wall. There's a deer antlers up on there. It's definitely like a lodge chic look in my office. Yeah.
But you and I have had conversations in the past, and you, when you go out into the outdoors, even by yourself, and I know you've done it with people, but when you're by yourself, you have mentioned to me that that's a renewing, it's a restful time. And so there's an element of that individual journey, which I think it's important. And I think maybe we need to understand the difference between isolating ourselves and actually having some solitude. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think isolation is unhealthy at times, right? We can run away from our issues when my wife doesn't like something I've done, and I run into the garage to pretend to work on something. That's actually an unhealthy practice there, because I'm not intentionally and mindfully engaging in what I'm doing. But when I hunt, or when I go ice fishing, or when I go for my hikes that I do, I take about an hour walk a day with my two large dogs in the woods where they don't have to be on leash. And if I'm mindful in doing that, if I'm aware of my presence within creation, if I'm aware of the Creator's presence around me, if I'm intentionally allowing my mind to be still instead of on my phone all the time, right? If I'm intentionally developing these practices, it's beneficial. But you're very right. Like it's interesting that the same thing can be detrimental or beneficial depending on how we approach it and our mindset in it. I so often see people walking and they've just got their phone in front of their face, right? And it's like, no, it's not that. You may be benefiting your body a bit, but your soul is actually withering away through that experience.
And if you're going to get out in creation, and I mean, you've shown me some pictures that just leave you looking and saying, wow.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're stuck on your phone or in your mind, like you miss out being present and appreciating what we have around us.
Well, I think that's where, there's parts of Buddhism which I think are helpful in that reminding us to be reflective and reminding us to be present in that place. And Jesus did this a lot, like the crowds would be pressing. And I know maybe you're watching this and you're a leader and you've got 1,000 emails and you got people to lead, but Jesus would feel that pressure of people pushing in on him. And Jesus numerous times would intentionally said he would slip away and go to a hillside and pray. Yeah. And so Jesus would, slip through the crowd unnoticed and would find a quiet place sitting in the grass, overlooking a lake, and he would spend time in intentional prayer, where he was quiet, where he was alone, where he was reflecting. And that's in the midst of an incredible pressure from thousands of people that are following him as he walks from town to town. And I think if Jesus could do that, I think we would do well to do the same.
Hmm. I feel the need to say here that, when we're talking about meditation and prayer and solitude, that sometimes the culture teaches this idea of like, we need to just let everything out and just completely empty ourselves.
Right.
Which there is some truth in that, but I think it's very important that we're careful.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, in releasing stress, intentionally releasing things that are weighing you down. Yeah.
Right. But then there's an element of what we're filling ourselves with.
Yes.
Is very important to understand that
Yeah.
Our life is not just about emptying ourselves and then going on with our life.
Yeah.
What are we filling ourselves with?
Well, and that's where, I mean, from my faith perspective, like I come from a Christian faith perspective. So I believe that there is a creator who has been revealed to us in the person of Jesus, the Christ. And so when I reflect, when I walk, when I am out, I intentionally have that reminder, like I am part of a larger story. I am part of a larger creation. I am part of a larger work of redemption in our world. And so I have a very hopeful perspective on our world because I believe that Jesus Christ is going to put all things right. And so for me, as I meditate and as I walk and as I reflect, I have that anchor point for me. So it's not just simply losing myself in wherever I am, because the challenge is you always have to come back, right? You can't just simply lose yourself in the woods and never return. Though sometimes I would like that. There's this re-engagement piece, and what kind of allows me to kind of retreat and then re-engage is this anchoring in the person of Jesus Christ. It's my faith that gives me that anchor point in that going and in that coming.
Well, I love that word re-engage. So maybe we can pivot back to the other part of that statement we were talking about. Then re-engaging into community,
yes,
is very important. And I think sometimes there's people out there that are like, no, I like to be alone. That's me. That's what I desire to do. That's what I do my best at when I'm by myself. But I would argue that that's not true. Like, I think we can come fully alive. Yes, there's an element of that, of being alone and refreshing and learning a lot, especially if you're spending time with God. But coming and living that out in community is so important. And I know you're a huge advocate of that.
Well, and I think particularly when you're leadership, particularly senior, so whether that's in an organization that you lead, whether it's a business, it's a nonprofit, it's a church, it's a mosque, if you're particularly in that senior management roles, they can be isolating. Leaders often talk about being in a full room, but they feel alone because they feel like they can't fully trust or be who they are, where they are. And I think as leaders, we need to push back against that a bit and say, no, actually, and we're going to talk about this, I think, in a few minutes, but actually, it's actually in part through my weakness that I lead. And I'm not afraid of being real with people. But then there's also the reality as leaders, sometimes we have to find safe places to be in meaningful community that might be apart from the organization or the context in which we lead. And so for me, I've got a few friends who I really trust and we regularly engage. So this summer I'm going on I've got a backpacking trip. And so every summer I've got 4 days with these guys who are leaders in their organizations. And it gives us a place just to be completely open and honest with one another. And so I think, yes, we all are different on the extrovert-introvert scale. I'm actually, I don't know which I am. I'm kind of in the middle. I love people and I love to get away and I love both. But wherever we are in that scale, there still needs to be kind of a meaningful community where we can process and feel heard and known and not alone. Because I think particularly leadership is isolating if we're not intentional. And we have to be intentional about creating those connections so that we have resiliency. So that when we do go through the crap that will occur when you lead, crap floats to the top, and you're going to face it. And so you need those places where you can process, and to intentionally develop them is hard because there's that mantra in the West, pull up your own bootstraps, right? Like, do it on your own. And I think that's really, it really is self-defeatist in the end. because no one gets there by themselves.
No. And I think you painted a nice picture there too of understanding that community has maybe a few different forms.
Oh yeah.
Where you have that inner circle, possibly those
Yep.
real close people that you trust, that you are vulnerable with and honest with. And then there's also some benefit in growing that circle and maybe people that you don't maybe associate with on a daily basis, but they are still part of your circle and community.
Yeah, I think understanding. I taught Heroes, which is a character development program in junior high schools for years. So I was a pastor in another church, and I'd go in and I would teach over 8 years. I taught 600 students or something, and I would go in. It was a lot of fun. But part of that Heroes Development Character Program, which I highly recommend if you're involved in the education world, just check it out. But they had these circles where you have your acquaintances, you have your buddies, and then you have your change friends. So as a leader, like those friends that speak into your heart, those people that know what's really going on, and intentionally being selective of those people. And I think sometimes people are challenged. Either way, they open that circle too big, and they share in ways that are not beneficial to those who can't handle what they're sharing. But also the opposite is true at times, where we restrict that, and that becomes so small, and no one actually knows what's going on. And in isolation, we wither. We are not created to be alone. And so I think as people who lead in whatever context that is, we need to be really intentional about creating space for those change friends and cultivating them. Because as we get older, they don't happen accidentally. Like I have to plan months in advance to go on this backpacking trip, but yet I know it's life-giving. And every year I come off of this trip and I feel fantastic, but I have to plan 6 months out to make it happen.
That's gold what you just shared there, because it's important to it doesn't happen by accident. You've got to be intentional and on purpose with that. And it just goes to show you that we don't arrive wherever we're heading, whatever our dreams, our goals are. We're not going to arrive there by ourselves. No. Even if we think we are self-made, or we think that we have it, right? It's just not true. And I'm glad that you said that, because it's very important. So you're a leader that has had years of experience in leading people. Like you've led hundreds of people, and what's important to catch here is that there's a lot of variety of people. Like there's a lot of ethnicities, different backgrounds, all that.
Absolutely.
What has been one of the challenging things in being a leader of many different types of people?
Well, I think within our context, in the faith-based context, you're leading a group of people who are voluntarily there. Like no one is being paid. You can't hire and fire. And so you're really working to bring people along on a vision together. And often you're very right. There's huge diversity. There's diversity in cultural perspectives. There's diversity in theological perspectives. Right. And so I think probably one of the challenges within the faith-based nonprofit, charitable work is figuring out how to be unified in vision, but also not coercive within the context that I lead, which is an Anabaptist church. I lead, but I really lead from behind. And so my role is to come along, is to equip, encourage, and empower the things that are already happening within the community of faith that we have. And so I think realizing, particularly in the nonprofit charitable work, kind of that when you're in those organizations, things move slowly. And I'm a driver. I like to get things done. And sometimes I just remind myself, hey, the kingdom of God isn't built in a day, and a church isn't built in a day. This work will outlast me. And so how do I become aware of that and not have it center on me? Because that's, I think, really dangerous when faith-based organizations begin to center on someone. And you see abuse of power, which many people are aware of. That's been in the news, right? Where people use their power in coercive and traumatic ways. And I want to intentionally push as far away from that as I can.
No, and I think you pointed out such an important factor here, where as leaders, sometimes people think when you only think in positional leadership,
Right.
you think that you are the authority, the end all, the one.
Yeah.
But the art of leadership is understanding how to not only provide a bit of vision and lead people in that vision, but empower your people, serve your people,
Yeah.
and not your people serving you. And it's and
That's
whether you're
that's
a
a key
prophet or not.
distinction, right? Like, I'm always careful. I never say my church.
Mm,
I always say the church I serve, or the church that I am
right.
called to love, or I use phrases
Yeah.
like that because it very like that use of power of, do I serve people or do they serve me? And in leadership, that can quickly flip and almost unconsciously. And I think that, and I believe in Jesus, I see the model of a leader who didn't exercise power over, but
Yeah.
exercised power with. And he was always empowering those around him to accomplish the mission that he was called on. And he didn't exercise power over, he wasn't coercive. And I think that often when we see people who lead faith communities become like that, like they've actually stepped away from the path of Jesus, which is always willing to meet people on their level, which is willing to have power with rather than power over. And I always have to remind myself that I don't ultimately lead this faith community. It is actually the people within this community that will outlast me. And it is God that we're accountable to.
Well, I'm going to say here, if you're listening and you don't lead in a faith community setting, you're not off the hook.
No.
This is important to catch. If you have employees or people that you lead, they work with you, you have to, there's something to catch here about how to serve them. And I have seen leaders do this well, and the benefit and the ripple effect is amazing for the business world, but it applies in faith, non-faith. It doesn't matter what you call it, whatever the organization is, this principle applies.
Well, I've heard it said, and I would very much agree, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're doing something wrong as a leader. Because our role is to actually encourage and find those people who can do it better than we can. And how do we empower them? How do we encourage them? I think leaders are often threatened by that. There's often this deep sense of inadequacy that can really prevent organization from thriving, because the leader feels threatened, and they can't have anyone who's better at something than they are in the room.
Right.
But that's actually, I believe, the way that we thrive and grow is as we lead, we're intentionally finding people who are better at doing it than we are. And we are getting behind them and making sure they have the resources that they need to do what they need to do.
That's so true. And you and I have had the privilege of sitting on a board together, a church board together. And I remember filtering things, and this is more my insecurities along the way as I continue to learn and grow as a leader. And I have a long way to go, but the things that I've learned, and you got people that are smarter than you, and sometimes you use that as like, oh man, I'm not supposed to be in this role, but you don't realize, actually, no, like leadership and community and working together, you will have people that are brighter, smarter, more experienced, and that's okay. And actually, that's important, as you just said.
Well, and in our church, it's kind of funny when I preach about 2 or 3 times a month, and there are people in our church who know Greek better than me, who know their scriptures better than me. And sometimes there's this idea that like I know everything, right? Or I'm perfect. It's like, no, like there are people in our church who probably individually do any one of these things better than I do. And my role is to kind of pull these together, right? And say, okay, how do I encourage these people? How do I bring them to the forefront? How do I hear from their perspective? So even I send my sermon at times to those in our church, say, hey, what do you think of my use of this Greek word? Or what's your thoughts on this? Because I know you actually know this better than I do. And that's okay.
You've already touched on this now, but because I would say that that's a rewarding thing about being in community, when you start getting all these different experiences, expertise, and different leaders in the community. But is there other things that kind of come to mind that you feel like, man, leading a big group of people, this is one thing that kind of sticks out as being rewarding.
I think the rewarding piece is seeing people flourish and thrive and experience the freedom that I believe God brings. And so seeing people coming into our community of faith who often come in broken, come in with traumas and wounds, and experience healing within the community, whether that's through our small groups, whether that's just being present in the community as we gather here on a Sunday, whether that's through some of the trauma workshops that we do. There's just a whole variety of ways, but seeing people grow and families experience healing in their lives. And one of my favorite parts of leading is actually stepping back. And in our church, it's not a very big church. We probably have 200 on a Sunday, maybe 500 would call it their church home. And but I love just looking out and seeing community flourish. And I don't have to go talk to it. Like there's certain people I will, but I love just sitting back and seeing what I believe is the work of God in this community, connecting people to one another, and then flourishing occurring because of that. And that just brings a smile to my face. And then seeing that ripple out into the community that we're planting, because I believe our community should be a better place because our church is here. And then seeing that kind of the ripples from this community here begin to kind of slowly make their way out, and then hear back from how those waves have reached the shores out there and now are starting to come back this way. And that always is a huge encouragement.
I love that, because one of my desires is to help people maximize their God-given potential. And it makes me think that in your leadership position and role, you get this privilege of getting to see that ripple effect roll out and see people living out their God-given potential and seeing them exercise it or discover it or continue to grow on it. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Well, I love it. I mean, and in some churches, like it's all about the pastor and it's all about him. But I love it. Like when there's a service here and I never get on stage, and it's people from the community all taking different parts and leading and sharing from their perspectives and doing things that are in their strengths. And I just kind of go, and I'm behind the scenes and I'm organizing it, I'm encouraging it. I'm like meeting for coffee to go over their sermons. I'm doing stuff, but then to just sit back and kind of go, hey, this is the work of God in our community. And I don't have to be the center. I don't even have to be seen. I'd love it for someone to come here on a morning and not know who the lead pastor is, and then they encounter me and they go, "Oh, you're the lead." And I think as leaders, sometimes we can feel threatened by that, but I think that's actually helping the community thrive, or the organization that we are leading. If everyone needs to know that you're the CEO when you walk in the room, right? There's something that may need to be questioned there.
Right. No, that's a good word. That's a good word. It's a good reflection point, because yes, if you feel like the spotlight always needs to be on you, maybe it's time to do some self-assessing.
Well, and I think that leadership, right? It has a power, and power is innately corruptive if not handled well. And often power, once we get it, we want to hold on to it. And that's why, for me, the person of Christ is so pivotal to me. It just totally upends my idea of what leadership is, because he had power, it says, and he intentionally divested of the privilege he had.
Right.
And so for me as a leader, I'm called to follow that path as someone of that faith. And so, I think it changes everything.
So as a leader, it's important not to be seeking this perfectionism that we have it all together. There's something to be said about when the leader is honest, vulnerable, when they're willing to share, their authentic selves. And I want to say that I have noticed you really practice that, and I specifically want to talk about some of the challenges that you've been through, and maybe more specific when it comes to you've had a bit of a stuttering problem, and maybe you can unpack how long that's been or whatever. But you've led in that, through that, and it's been amazing to see you not only own it, but be willing to share it with the world, and for all of us to go, okay, that's been his struggle, possibly, and however you perceive that, but you have been able to still take the lead and go, okay, I'm doing this even though this is not one of my strengths.
Yeah. So disfluency for me has definitely been a challenge and also an opportunity. As a young child, I stuttered brutally. I couldn't have a one-on-one conversation like we are having right now. It results in a lot of, I was teased a lot as a child. My teenage years were not ones I look on with fondness. I hear people say, "Oh, I want to be a teenager again." I'm like, no, that's not good. Thank you. And as I got older, I felt a call to pastoral work. Now, the challenge is pastoral work is very public. You're speaking, you're doing funerals, you're doing weddings, you're doing sermons. It's public speaking all the time. And so you naturally wouldn't think of someone with disfluency as a pastor. But I felt that call and to do it. And so I felt to be obedient to God, that this was what I was called to do. And so as I've led, I've had a growing realization that I don't lead in spite of my disfluency. I actually lead through my disfluency. The disfluency in and of itself is actually part of God's work in me and in the community that I lead. And so for me, my disfluency reminds me that I actually really need God, that I actually can't do this on my own, that it's not about me. I would say that my disfluency is also what part it keeps me humble. I can't hide it very well, right? It's very obvious. And so I think it like keeps my head from getting too big, which is probably a good thing. We need these reminders that we're not perfect and that we can't be. And so I've gone through fluency training. I've done speech therapy for years, which is why we can have this conversation. But still, there are times when I'm speaking, particularly if I'm tired, if I'm stressed, where my disfluency on stage is really hard. And so I've had to navigate that and just acknowledge it from the stage at times to say, hey, this morning I'm a little tired. I'm struggling. Love your grace. Let's take a moment to pray. And, you know, one of the most encouraging notes I got was a few years ago. And there was a 6-year-old boy in our church with autism, and he struggled with words. And he was in a sermon because he didn't want to go to our kids' ministry. And he heard me stutter during a sermon. And it was one particularly I felt awful about. Like I stuttered for the majority of it. I felt really frustrated. I just wanted to crawl into a hole. I don't know if you've ever done that, where you maybe lead an event or you do something, and after you're just like, that was a bomb, and I just don't want to see anyone for a day. And I felt that I went home. I was frustrated. I just wanted to like sit on my backyard with a beer and not talk to anyone the rest of the afternoon. And I got an email a few hours later, and it was from the mom of this boy. And she said, "My son heard you stutter, and I wanted to say thank you." He turned to me and said, "Mommy, does Pastor Tim have to practice his words too?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, maybe then I can be a pastor as well."
Wow.
And it was this, you know, and that really touched me, that this 6-year-old boy could see a potential for him, for God using him, right? He kind of went, whoa, like Pastor Tim has to practice his words, and that's okay if I have to as well. And so, and I've received numerous notes like that over the years, which have been a good reminder that, as Paul says, that it's actually that God works through us in our weaknesses. And we hate that because we want to hide our weaknesses. We want to bury them. We don't want anyone to see the things that we don't do perfect, quote unquote. But it's actually in those very things that God is often working. And if we can kind of get over that self-embarrassment and shame, can actually be a way that others can experience the healing in their own lives.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that story. I have loved watching how you navigate disfluency. You've done such an amazing job.
I'm not sure if I always have.
But I got to say this, Tim, because I think you're an amazing communicator, and you have owned it. And I can almost want to say it this way, that it's almost become a bit of your superpower, in the way you've been very vulnerable and honest with it, that you're able to connect. And I mean,
Right.
that
I'm
story
real.
you just shared is just one of many. There's other people that are sitting there going, okay, that you've taught us that we can be ourselves, and you're not trying to be anybody else. And I'm pretty sure there's been temptations and challenges along the way where we try to be like somebody else, but you are being Tim, and that's why you're able to have the impact that you're having with people. So that's very cool.
Well, thank you. And I think part of leading is learning to be comfortable in your own skin. And as I'm 41 this year, so I'm not old by any stretch, but as I've gotten older, that's something I've actually really cherished is becoming comfortable in your own skin and just being, this is who I am. I don't have to be somebody else. I don't have to lead like somebody else. Andy Stanley is a preacher that I love, and I would love to preach like Andy Stanley, but it's not me, right? Like there's tips and techniques I can learn from him, but if I try to be him, man, it just doesn't work. And so leading from who we actually are, and I think that's part of the pressure of our world, is this idea of what a leader is this perfect person, and I think we need to intentionally model a different way. That it is okay to be who you are and to lead from that place.
And because the reality is that you have some skill sets, some giftings that God has given you to lead where you are in the arenas that God has given you. And when you're focused on somebody else, you're forgetting that, hey, actually you have some uniqueness and some strength in the way you can lead. You just have to maybe discover it, unwrap it a little bit and work, continue to work on it and grow it. But let's not play that comparison game for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a killer game to play. And so I've learned to get off that a little bit.
Hey, I want to pivot our conversation for a moment here, because as the type of leader that you are, you've had a lot of experience in leading volunteers. Yeah. And I've often thought
that is what I call it.
What was that, sorry?
Herding cats. That's how I think of it at times. Yeah.
Well, there you go. Well, that's the thing, right? And I've often thought that, leading volunteers is almost like a bit of a special call, and it's different than leading in a corporate setting where you have employees. But I think that everybody could learn a little bit about the power of leading volunteers. And I'm just wondering, would you say that leading volunteers, it is a little bit different? Do you think it's a bit of a spiritual calling? Is it different? What do you think? And
it is different. I think often, and I've seen this, sometimes leaders hop between the volunteer world and the for-profit world, and they think that their skills immediately translate, and they don't. Both ways. Also, as if I jumped into a for-profit, because you don't have the curse of power of money, of paying people, and so you have to really learn to, how do you lead by vision? How do you draw people on a shared vision together that helps people say, I'm willing to donate 5 hours of my time or my funds towards this. And so I think, whereas in for-profit, and I have done for-profit leading as well, and I do have a staff here that does get paid, you can be more directive. You can move quicker, and that's great to have that ability to do that. That's why they're paid. But in a volunteer roles, it's really relational. It's working alongside people. It's listening to them and creating space for them to thrive. And I think the challenge sometimes when we take the business world and directly apply it into the volunteer world is we forget that that people are voluntarily there. And so we need to really treasure their time, their investment, and then really encourage them. I think communication, particularly in the volunteer world, is really, really important. You need to over communicate. One email won't do it. You need to intentionally be meeting with people more. And so if you're making a transition from the for-profit to the nonprofit, you'll probably find that things move slower, and there's more of a relational component to it. And that there is a need to work more from your vision and mission. why of what we do. And so, yeah, it's not something I'm perfect at, but something I'm growing at. And sometimes I have a bit of an entrepreneurial perspective. So sometimes I can run a little ahead and then I have to say, oh no, people don't actually know what's going on. I need to back this up and I need to slow this down. So usually anything I do within our context here is about half as slow as I'd like to do it. And I have to be okay with that it's going to take some time, but that's actually in time and in working together that actually is a much stronger organization. Because some nonprofits are built really quick. They're built around one person. This church explodes, they're huge, but then often they explode inwards just as quick. So what rises on one person will fall on one person. And so I think going slow and building for the long term. And I often say the church will outlast me. And so how do I shepherd? How do I lead the church in a way that they are healthy beyond my time here?
Yeah. I love that. And I think if we have leaders listening that serve in different arenas, I think it's very important I would encourage you, if you're in the corporate world, to learn from the nonprofit volunteer world, because you're going to grasp something that could really help you over here. And I know it can be a crossover, and it's just.
And there's crossovers. Yeah. I've got a friend who owns a large construction and it's a business here in Edmonton. And every time we go for breakfast, I come away with more ideas. I say, okay, how do I implement this in my world? Now I can't just directly straight translate this, but how do I put this into my context? And I've stolen many great ideas from our breakfasts because they do speak to one another. They do. Sometimes the way that things are implemented it's just a little different.
I love that. No, it's important that we can learn and we have to understand how to discern that and how to tweak, but it's important to really keep our antennas up and how can we learn from other arenas.
Absolutely.
So Tim, I'd love to ask, I mean, we've talked about a lot of things and especially when it comes to some spiritual disciplines. Do you have some advice for us on how to get some spiritual disciplines on track? Whether, you're a seasoned, you've been in the faith for a long time, or maybe you're starting out. Is there some things that you would encourage us to keep in mind?
Well, I'd love to tell you I'm perfect at it and that I read my scripture every day and all this, but I don't. I'm a father of 3 young kids. My life is chaotic. I've got 2 large dogs and I work full time and my wife works about half time and we homeschool and life is just chaotic times. And Walter, I know that you've got young kids as well, right? Like, I hear some people say, "Oh, I get up every morning at 6 a.m. and I spend this hour in deep reflection and prayer." I'm like, man, I'm lucky if I get 10 minutes. Like, if I get up at 6, the kids hear me up and they're at their doors wanting to get up. So I think in every season, maybe you don't have kids, maybe you're retired, or maybe you're. There's all kinds of places that we're in. But I think, sorry, what do you have in front of you? What are the opportunities that could be right in front of you? So an opportunity for me is my dogs need to be walked. And so how do I, when I take my dogs for a walk, intentionally use that time to practice the discipline of faith? How do I use that time to pray, to reflect, to actually become present within creation? And so I think finding those opportunities, whether it might be you say, I need to read my scriptures. And so you realize, okay, in the evenings, you got usually 20 minutes. I mean, I think one thing we need to practice, and this is growing, is a realization of the negative, particularly the negative impacts of social media on us. And I'm going to admit right now, I doom scrolled last night on the toilet for an hour. From 10 to 11. And I could have been doing so many other beneficial things. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, what have I done? The last hour, what have I done? Like, I'm addicted to this dopamine rush. And so I'm trying to develop this practice. I'm not perfect yet, but I'm like, hey, 9 p.m., my phone goes down. And I'm not on my phone because I want to create space for being present and for other nourishing, truly recreating things to enter into my life. And so whether that's reading, whether that's prayer, whether that's solitude, whether that's silence, whether that's reflective prayer, I think part of the challenge is we filled in all the nooks and crannies of our lives. And so when no one's talking to us, we're on our phone. So where is the space for holistic health? Where is the space for our mental health and that, our spiritual health? And so I know there's lawsuits now going on from schools, social media companies, and there's all kinds of stuff ongoing. And I'm not saying all social media is bad. I'm on social media. I'm all over it. Our churches as well. But I think we're realizing that we end up developing something, but it actually ends up developing us. We become the product. And there's this growing realization that I think putting aside our phones is one of the most spiritual things we can do. And saying, what could I do that will actually renew and nourish my soul? And that's not always the easy choice. Sometimes that's going for a walk. Sometimes that's prayer. Sometimes that's scripture. Sometimes that's sitting quietly for half an hour and just being okay, being still and quiet, and allowing your brain to process all the busyness of the day so you can actually sleep well.
Wow, that's gold. I love how that in these spiritual disciplines, there's an element of, yes, maybe taking on some practices, but it's actually also letting go of those things that actually don't help us out at all. And so,
right. Well, that's even why fasting has been a traditional practice in many different faiths for thousands of years. Fasting is common around the world, and because fasting is an intentional rejection of desire. It's an intentional rejection of saying my desire doesn't actually have to control me.
Right.
And so I can choose to say no to food. And in doing so, I'm actually developing and building the practice of willpower.
Right.
I'm actually building that by choosing voluntarily to fast. Now, I'm not saying we should participate in coercive fasting, but when we fast, we're actually building the muscle to say no and to say yes. Right. And so that when we get to our phone and it's 9 p.m. and we really should put it down, in fasting by a voluntary rejection of desire, we've actually built the capacity to say no to things that we desire that may not be good for us. I think that fasting is a practice that I'm rediscovering. And so I'm finding ways in my month to regularly fast.
Right.
And in doing so, reminding myself that my desires don't actually define and control me.
I love that. That's beautiful. You said that so wonderful. I appreciate that. That was so good. So, you've already alluded to that you're a young leader, and I agree, there's so much more for Tim. I'm wondering, is there something that you're looking forward to in your leadership journey? Like, there's something in the horizon that maybe you're like, it'd be really cool if it heads in that direction, or
private jet. No. Just spend your money too. No, man. Whenever I'm like a pastor, people automatically think like TV evangelist. I'm like, no. There's no private jets in the future. Do what? Eugene Peterson, who was a pastor and author I loved, was famous around the world, yet he pastored a small church of about 80 people for the vast majority of his life. And he happily did that. He never put himself out there. People found him in his works, and that's how he became known. And I think Eugene Peterson modeled a pastoral presence in a community that wasn't about him, but by his presence, he was a blessing. And so honestly, if I could pastor well for the next 25 years, love people well, develop communities that transform communities, which is kind of one of my taglines. If I can do that well, I'll be happy. I think there's something to be said about the long walk of obedience, where you choose to be faithful in the context in which you are placed, and you take contentment and meaning and satisfaction in that. And not saying that we don't push and grow and thrive, but it's not for the sake of myself that I grow and push. It's for the sake of the communities that I participate in. And so, I'd love to maybe look at getting my doctorate at some point. But my wife has her master's and I got mine. Now it's her turn to get her doctorate. So she told me I can't get mine until she gets hers. So that might be a little ways out, but that's cool. Just love to faithfully serve where I'm placed and continue to grow. So I think as leaders, taking continuing education is so critical. I stopped, did my master's a few years ago, which was an amazing experience personally. And then this summer, I'll be taking a week to go away to a seminary and just read and reflect and think and create a week for that. So yeah, I want to just develop those opportunities along the way to continue to grow and serve well. Yeah.
Hey, so as you continue on the journey, like I love this. I love where you're desiring to go, and I think you're definitely going to accomplish that and do it. Do you have a favorite leadership advice that's been given to you that you think about, maybe that you kind of hold on to and say, hey, no, this has been
you're not as important as you think.
You're not what?
You're not as important as you think. I think in leadership, we can end up building things around us, and it is a weight that we cannot bear. And I think and maybe this is particularly in my context, where sometimes faith-based organizations can become very personality driven. Yeah. But reminding myself, I'm not as important as I think. Yes, I'm valuable. I'm dearly loved by God. I am placed here. Absolutely, God has given me unique giftings. But I'm replaceable, and that's okay. Like, there's a freedom in that. There's a joy in that, and knowing that God is working beyond me too. And so I think leaders, what we do is important, is critically important, and the communities we develop transform lives. But at the same time, it's not all about us. And if we can hold that loosely and with humility, I think we will last longer and do a better job of things.
That's solid. That is solid. Great advice. Okay, so Tim, you're on the It Matters podcast, and so what I would love to ask.
I was hoping for a sticker, maybe.
Darn, we missed our chance. Next time.
Okay.
So, in the season that you're in, what matters to you? I know you've told us a lot today, and there might be quite a bit there that matters to you. But is there one thing in this season that matters to you?
As a person of faith, I can't help but go there, because my faith drives so much of what I do and shapes who I am. Yeah. What matters most to me in this season is that people would see Christ in me. That as I lead, that as I serve, that people would grow in their love and knowledge of Jesus Christ, and that the communities that I'm a part of, whether that's our church community, whether that's the geographical community that our church is engaged with, that they would experience the healing and the wholeness that I believe comes through knowing Christ. And that's my biggest passion. And so I can't help but go there, because I'm a person of faith, and that shapes everything I do and who I am. But yeah, that's what matters to me most above all. And if I fade into the background and people are healing and growing and moving forward, and this community is thriving, that's great. Yeah.
Well, that's perfect, Tim, how you responded to that. Because then I have maybe one final question for you, and that would be, what would you say to someone who may be interested in exploring faith, and exploring a faith journey? Yeah. What would you say to them?
Oh man, I'd say it's different than you think. I think a lot of us have preconceived ideas of faith. I often say, like Ned Flanders has shaped people's ideas of what church and Christian faith is. I grew up watching the Simpsons, and that was like the caricature. But I would say there's so much wealth and richness in developing a faith perspective, right? And leaning on the wisdom of the community, and realizing, I think the biggest part of exploring our faith is realizing we're part of a bigger story. Right. Our story doesn't end with us. We are part of God's redemptive, transformative work in our world. So finding a community, a faith community, in your area that you can connect into and begin to explore what that means, is important. Because I think we've been steeped in this post-modernity scientific Western viewpoint, which basically says anything worth doing or thinking about is quantifiable by science. Right. Yet the transcendent is not quantifiable. You can't measure faith any more than you can smell a rose with your ear. It's the wrong tool for the wrong being. And so there's all these things, love, grace, peace, joy, that science can't quantify, that it can't measure. And that's the place of the transcendent. That's the place where God resides. And so I'd also say, if you're exploring faith, science and faith aren't opposed. I so often I've run into people saying, hey, like science says one thing, but scripture says another. I say, whoa. God is created both science and scripture. They reveal who he is, and they're not in opposition. And so, I think if we read scripture well, it will always align with our world as well, and we don't need to see them in opposition to one another. I just think that science and faith are not in opposition. They speak to two different realities. One is the mode of creation, but in faith we speak to the who of creation.
I love it.
Sorry, that was probably more than you wanted, but
no, not at all.
Ask her about faith and exploring faith, and you're going to get it. So
I asked the question, and I really appreciate. This has been such a special time, Tim, and I've loved our conversation, and we'll have to do this again. But thank you for being you and bringing it, and just sharing with us what is such an important aspect to your life and to my life, and thank you for jumping on this podcast today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Walter.
Oh, you're very welcome. Well, that's it for today. This is the conclusion of this episode. And so for all of you, thanks for joining us. Please share this episode, like it, comment. Let us know what you think. If you have questions for myself or even Tim, we would love to connect you more. And so until next time, remember to dream big, lead well. All right. Bye for now.